Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jigar Shah. Jigar was the director of the Loan Programs Office in the U.S. Department of Energy from March of 2021 to January of 2025, and he has told me that he is a serial entrepreneur. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jigar, and let you tell what you've been up to since January.
Well, as many people know, I was a political appointee in the Biden administration. And so my job came to an end on inauguration day. And so I've been spending a lot of time talking to entrepreneurs and innovators and investors and figuring out, what the lay of the land is and figuring out how I can most be helpful in this moment. But in my past, I helped popularize solar finance through Reset Edison and infrastructure as a service finance through Generate Capital. And then along the way, worked for Richard Branson at the Carbon War Room, figuring out how to, elevate entrepreneurs as the main folks who are, pushing solutions to the climate crisis. But been an exciting career.
I guess to start off the conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit about the time you spent at the Loan Programs Office. The funding in the office increased tenfold while you were there, mostly as a result of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and also the Inflation Reduction Act. What was it like trying to dole out all of that money, and how do you feel the office was effective in getting that to the right projects?
Yeah, no, I think it was an awesome responsibility and opportunity as somebody who's been an investor in my career. You don't dole out money, right? Because that's how you lose money. And so what you do is you create a framework and you tell people, hey, if you meet this framework, then we've got a loan for you. And if you don't meet this framework, then we don't have a loan for you. And I would say that the vast majority of the 400 to 500 companies that we worked closely with didn't quite meet the framework. And so there were 55 deals that we got across the finish line. And then there's probably another 200 or so that we think could have gotten across the finish line, but they needed to do more work on their end to improve their business, right? And to de-risk, their feedstock agreements or their offtake agreements, or, get better quality contractors to do the construction of their project. And so, it was a lot of education work, but I'm really proud of that work because I think a lot of those companies, regardless of whether they used our office or not, were better for the interactions that they had with us.
Mm-hmm. What did you see actually happening on the ground since some of those projects got started? Have you seen things really taking off in the loans that you did fund?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, everything that started construction is still under construction, and so they're all going to be completed. And I think that when you look at, just the sheer amount of like coordination that's done with the technical colleges, all of those folks are now getting trained to work in those facilities. I think when you look at all the tariffs and some of the other stuff that's happening in the US, a lot of those facilities are even more under demand now. And so you're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in buying stuff, from those local manufacturers. And so I think all in all, the thesis worked. Certainly there are many people who had a hard time raising equity or had a hard time getting to the finish line and final investment decision. But for those folks who got to final investment decision and started construction, I think they're doing very well.
And I don't want to make this a political conversation, but I have heard a lot about how President Trump has stopped funding for certain things. It sounds like the projects that you were able to get moving in the right direction are continuing. They haven't been stopped in any of these executive orders. Is that true?
Yeah, all of the loan programs office loans are doing fine
Okay.
because ultimately, the Trump administration wants to use the loan program to promulgate nuclear power or other technologies. And they know that if the loan programs office is no longer a reliable partner, well, then no one will ever use that program for nuclear.
Mhm. What are some of the more game-changing projects that you think were funded and are in progress at this point? Do you see anything that's really going to make a big difference going forward, or what has you the most excited?
Well, all of them are equally exciting to me. I mean, that's the beauty of the work I do. But for instance, Wabash in Indiana is using pet coke, which at this point is basically a waste product that comes out of the refinery, and turning it into blue ammonia, which I think is amazing, right? Because the ammonia that they're offsetting is ammonia coming from Ukraine using Russian gas, shipped into Tampa. And so like being able to make, more ammonia here locally, I think is amazing. I think when you look at loans that we did to Montana Renewables and the, changing out of an existing refinery to one that can produce sustainable aviation fuel, that is going really well with Calumet. But also like the EV chargers, right? EVgo got a loan from us and they were able to draw under their loan authority. And, they're on track to becoming a profitable company and providing services to EV owners around the country. And so it's great to see us be able to really help them with their customer service challenges and some of the other challenges that, were holding them back and that they made pretty strong commitments to improve along with, the loan, underwriting, but also the restart of the Palisades nuclear plant. I mean, super exciting to see our first nuclear plant being restarted. And as a result, the Constellation folks have decided to restart, nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania, and NextEra has decided to restart a nuclear reactor in Iowa. So it's great to have that catalytic impact.
Yeah, nuclear is near and dear to my heart. I spent 13 years in the nuclear Navy and worked at the Quad Cities plant before I ended up in the journalism field. But what do you think about nuclear new builds? Do you have an opinion on where that might go and how small modular reactors might fit into the energy mix?
Well, it's so great to see your service. I grew up in Sterling, Illinois, so not far from the Quad Cities.
Oh,
And so, yeah, I know that plant very well. Look, I think the key to nuclear power is to recognize that no one wants to actually take the full risk stack. And so, the hyperscale data center companies have all said that they're willing to sign a power purchase agreement at above market prices to buy 24 by 7 nuclear power. The utilities have all said, if you build it, we will buy it at the end of construction, right? They don't want to be in charge of construction, but they'll buy it once the facility is constructed. And then you've got a bunch of technology companies that the Department of Energy has funded that represent the best technologies that are available in the whole world, right? Whether it's the whole tech 300 megawatt reactor or the GE Hitachi 300 megawatt reactor or NuScale or X Energy or TerraPower, or there's all sorts of companies who have fantastic new designs that are featuring the best safety upgrades that have been figured out for the last 20 years and with lots of interesting new products. I think, but none of those companies have the ability to build the reactors. So like if you look at TerraPower, for instance, which is funded by Bill Gates, he's not willing to put the money in to just build the entire plant in Wyoming. And so figuring out how you take all those puzzle pieces and put them together such that a project finance shop would be willing to fund the plant has proven to be a lot more complicated than people think. And so that was a lot of the work that me and my team were doing is we were really close to getting all those pieces together, and we described that in the nuclear liftoff report that was published last year. But we'll see whether this administration continues that good work.
mhm. I think the thing that has always worried most people is the economics behind nuclear and getting things built on time and on budget. And we've seen, the Vogel project, of course, went over, and a lot of people point to that as a reason not to ever build another nuclear plant again, which I think is ludicrous. But can the U.S. supply chain eventually get to a point where we're building nth of a kind instead of first of a kind reactors where we can see these benefits of sustained kind of cookie cutter plants getting put in and hopefully bring those timelines into line? Is that possible?
Well, of course it's possible. I mean, we trained over 15,000 people at the Vogel nuclear plant, right? At any given time, they had 9,000 people working at that site. And, Unit 4 came in a lot cheaper than Unit 3. And if you just built two more units at that site or at VC Summer, which is, as you know, maybe only 70 miles away,
Mm-hmm.
the costs with the existing Inflation Reduction Act incentives for the exact same cost as it costs to build Vogel would be less than $100 a megawatt hour. And the hyperscale data center companies are all happy to pay that price.
Mhm.
So we're ready to build nth of a kind projects now with the AP 1000 across the country, but the confidence isn't there. So if you ask Bechtel whether they can do exactly the cost structure that they did for Unit 4, again, they won't promise you that they can. Right? And if you talk to Westinghouse, they're saying, well, we're focused in Poland. And if you talk to others, like, they're all distracted, right? And so the South Carolina governor is trying really hard to get everyone to focus on VC Summer. He has an RFP on the street right now to get everybody to put in their expressions of interest to build 2 reactors at least at that site. And so we'll see if everyone can find the confidence to, help with clean energy dominance. But right now, I feel like people have a little bit lost their swagger.
And of course, clean energy is so important as we think about climate change and trying to drive down emissions. I know you have been an advocate for market driven solutions to climate change. Why do you feel that's the best way to tackle the problem?
Well, it's the way that we choose to tackle the problem in the United States, right? I mean, the alternative is to have a socialist government like, Russia or China. And those are places where they've been able to build new nuclear, right? Because they just tap down it. Right? And I think for me, like, I think that that is not something that the US government's going to do. And so the question becomes, how do we take the US government's approach, right, which is to provide tax credits or loans or other things and help to build this public private partnership to commercialize extraordinary US technology, right? The AP 1000 was shared with the Chinese, right? That's how they built their first couple of reactors, and then they've modified that design to build 30 new reactors, right, which are under construction now. We need to stop giving away our technology to China and figure out how to commercialize stuff here, right? And I think we made a tremendous amount of progress over the last 4 years on which models work, and I, hope that the current administration is going to build off of what we proved because we just have thousands of companies with extraordinary technology ready to be commercialized to meet this moment of this electricity supercycle that we find ourselves in.
Speaking of climate change, can you talk a little bit about your perspective and how you feel about the current situation that we're in? Has your view changed or evolved much over time?
No, I mean, clearly climate change is real and you're starting to see impacts of climate in terms of, stronger storms or more wildfires or changing weather patterns or all the other things that you're seeing. You're already seeing like Zillow and other folks like starting to put climate right into the app because they want you to know when you buy a new house if that house is likely to be underwater in 15 years,
Mhm.
right? And so there's a lot of that stuff happening. But at the same time, people want to live a modern lifestyle, right? I get it. And there's a lot of people around the world who want to live a modern lifestyle. And so the question becomes, how do we give them the energy abundance that they seek to be able to, live a modern lifestyle while we're reducing emissions? We're lucky in that we have all the technologies available today to affordably do that, right? It is way cheaper to build solar plus battery storage today than it is to do almost anything else. And that's why 93% of everything that the Energy Information Administration expects us to add to the grid in the United States this year is going to be clean. And 90% of everything that is getting a grid connection globally is going to be clean, right?
Mhm.
Even in Pakistan or in China. And so, like, it's an extraordinary thing that we're in this spot right now. But I do think that the industry itself continues to act as if it's fragile and it's not fragile. It's by far the most dominant force in electricity right now, but I don't think it acts that way.
And speaking of clean energy, part of getting a project built is financing it. And I know there's actually a finance principle that's been named after you. It's called the Jigger-Shaw rule. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that? What are the key concepts behind it, and why is it so important to follow the Jigger-Shaw rule?
Well, so the rule was established on a podcast. I'm not quite sure how it got named after me, but basically it was a conversation around the German feed-in tariff program and the Ontario feed-in tariff program in Canada. And what I was saying was the way that those programs were structured was so bad that the investors were making huge returns on the backs of the people of Germany and the people of Ontario, and we didn't need such lucrative subsidies, right? And so, the Jigger-Shaw rule is that you just can't do dumb policy, right? Because if you do dumb policy, what ends up happening is you have higher electricity rates in Ontario and in Germany because they're still paying off those tariffs, right? And there's a lot more intelligent ways of structuring that policy so that you're helping the entrepreneurs in the private sector actually get their costs down over time and not keep their costs stubbornly high on purpose, right? And so that's a lot of what that's about. And we've learned a lot around how to, put volume-based tariffs and so that things go down, but also moving away from feed-in tariffs altogether because those feed-in tariffs, cost about 10 times more than the tax credits and the other structures that we've used in the US.
You talk about policy, and you also mentioned earlier that solar now with battery storage is some of the cheapest new install energy that you can build. So, what sort of policies do you think are necessary going forward that might support maybe other technologies? And is it time to ramp down on the incentives that are given out to solar and maybe even wind and some of these other technologies?
Well, I'm on the record of saying that we need to ramp down solar and wind incentives starting in 2012. So I've been on the bandwagon of the fact that we need to start ramping those incentives down. And part of the reason I want to ramp them down is precisely because we're in this situation right now where, they're at risk. And why are they at risk? Because they're really expensive, right, for taxpayers. And so because our volumes are so large. And so I think we're at a point now where we do need to ramp them down. I think it is going to cause our power purchase agreement rates to go up, right? So then, we're going to have slightly more expensive product, but that's still a lot cheaper than new natural gas, right? Which is coming in at $95 a megawatt hour today. And so, I think clean energy continues to be the cost leader. But I do think that we have very complicated tax structures, very complicated legal structures, all of which serve to reduce competition in the marketplace. And, we want to increase competition to get the cost down for everybody. I do think that our technologies, though, that still need that support, right? Whether it's nuclear power or geothermal power or next generation hydro or grid enhancing technologies or other things where you see the technologies are like rapidly commercializing, but it's not quite cost effective. And as a result, having more government incentives is important to be able to make sure that American technology is scaled up here in America. That being said, right, because the volumes are so low, the cost of the taxpayers are also very low, right? And so I do think that ultimately, as the cost of a policy becomes material to the American taxpayer, then it's time to start phasing it out.
What's your feeling on carbon capture technology? Do you think there is a future for CCS?
I think there has to be, right? I mean, part of the solution has to be pulling CO2 out of the air because there are some industrial processes, there's some things that we do that where fossil fuels will really be the best way of solving that part of a modern lifestyle. And so we're going to have to figure out CCS. And I think we have. Like when you look at the ADM facility, which is operated very stably, but we've learned a lot of lessons from that. When you think about the new CCS projects that we're putting in place now, there's about 100 million tons a year of CCS projects that are very cost effective to do versus the $85 tax credit that gets paid for CCS. And so those projects should get done. And hopefully, if we do all of those projects, then the cost of CCS will come down.
What about fusion? That's another technology that we think about and we think is on the horizon, but it still seems to be just a little way out. What's your thought on that?
Well, we've made huge breakthroughs on fusion, right? Because of the access to supercomputers, right? People had extraordinary ideas for fusion back in the 1980s, but they had no cost-effective way of testing their models. Today, because you can rent a supercomputer for 5 million bucks, you can test all these models on a supercomputer and you can tell, within reasonable accuracy whether the thing is going to work. And so as a result, you've seen a huge amount of money raised for a variety of different approaches, right? From magnets to lasers. And we'll see which ones win. But it does seem to me like the first pilot facilities will get built this decade.
There's small fusion companies, and then, of course, there's the big ITER project over in France. Where do you think we're going to see the real game-changing technology that gets utilized. Is there any thoughts in your mind which one will win out?
No, I'm not really an expert in it, but what I find with this kind of stuff though, it's never the technology itself that matters. It's execution that matters. I think when you look at like First Solar, for instance, in the cadmium telluride space in solar manufacturing, right? There's no reason for First Solar to be successful. Clearly, silicon-based silicon cells are far more efficient, et cetera, but First Solar has just out executed everybody.
Mhm.
Right, and so as a result, they're a huge company and they're continuing to be successful. Like, that to me comes from execution, and so I don't know who's gonna be a better execution partner, whether it's the magnetic folks or laser folks, but I'm excited to see all of these great technologies flourish, and some of them will go bankrupt and others will be successful.
And of course, we are hearing about data centers. Everybody's talking about data centers and the enormous load that they're going to demand. What do you see happening in the future as far as load growth is concerned? Do we need to worry about these data centers like overwhelming our grid?
Well, we most certainly don't need to worry about the data centers overwhelming our grid. But I think it is important to recognize that when these kinds of large loads become real, right, they have with data centers, then you force a conversation, right? And so we did a tremendous amount of work under the Biden administration, and the load growth documentation is still on the DOE website. And so you can see all of the great work we've done to show that our grid can handle 25,000 megawatts of new load by the end of the decade, which is what we continue to expect AI data centers to demand. And there's a lot of smart ways of doing this, right? Whether it's with nuclear power or geothermal power, or whether it's doing demand response and demand flexibility solutions to allow the existing grid to work, or curtailment solutions. And so there's really a tremendous amount of science and structure that is coming around this conversation because the AI data center companies are so serious and they really want to interconnect faster. There's so many solutions that we've been studying for the last 20 years that have gotten a new fresh look.
What about affordability and reliability, and how might this increase in demand affect those?
Well, I think the increase in demand could make things more affordable, right? I mean, we have way overbuilt our transmission and distribution systems. I think everyone acknowledges that. We used to have 70% asset utilization of our T&D infrastructure. Today, that asset utilization is less than 45% for transmission and less than 30% for distribution, meaning we've way overbuilt our transmission and distribution system because we want to accommodate the peaks. And now we've got to focus on figuring out how to fill in the gaps, right? And that's where virtual power plants, demand flexibilities, and all of that stuff is coming online. And you look at SPP, the independent system operator in the, sort of center south of our country, and they are now saying that their reserve margins are so low that the only way they're going to stave off rolling blackouts this year is by increasing amounts of uses of demand response, right? And that's incredible because those technologies have been piloted for 30 years and no one ever gave them a gosh darn contract. And now they're all getting contracts.
Mhm.
And so it's great to see these solutions really scale up. So we have all the solutions necessary to maintain affordability in the face of load growth, but we have to be intentional about it, right? There's a lot of people who like to overbuild stuff and increase electricity bills slash taxes for the average resident because they're lazy. And you can't be lazy anymore. And then it happens to be that all of these solutions also improve reliability. And so you're starting to see a ton of batteries getting added, probably 100 gigawatts of batteries will get added between now and 2030. And that really provides a lot of very important tools to the utilities to be able to manage the grid in a more reliable fashion.
Well, this has been really interesting, Jigger. I appreciate you speaking with me. Is there anything that maybe I haven't asked about that you'd like to touch on before we wrap up the podcast?
Well, look, I think that the key to this moment right now is execution and making good decisions. And so a lot of what I've been doing personally is working with executive teams to figure out how to like help them make good decisions in this moment. I think right now there's probably 4 to 500 companies who could become billion-dollar companies out of this moment because of the electricity super cycle, but making good decisions is the key to taking advantage of this opportunity to really help your company become profitable.
For listeners, I've been speaking with Jigar Shah. He was the former director of the Loan Programs Office at the U.S. Department of Energy and a serial entrepreneur. So thank you for your time, and I appreciate you sharing your insight.
Of course.